Welcome to the Cafe Culture Podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
Well, good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? That's the first thing I might say. I'm going to be talking for, I think, probably about half an hour, if that's okay. So please bear with me. And you'll find some images, a set of images on your tables, which we might be referring to at points through the evening. So the talk I'm going to give this evening, as Kay just said, has been co-developed by myself and V. Pollock, who is Professor of Public Art at Newcastle University. And what we're talking about is big public art, its failures and sometimes successes. I'll be talking about a range of artworks and projects, some of which may be familiar to you, and some which you might not know about. Some will be illustrated in those pictures on your tables. And ultimately, I'm going to try and ask the question, how much does size matter in public art practice? So what I'm going to do over the next half an hour or so is firstly to give you a brief outline, and I promise it will be brief, of the history of public art in the UK as it relates to regeneration practice. And secondly, to consider where we're at now in terms of big public art projects. In recent years, many such artworks have been proposed but have not been realised, and I'll be considering some of the reasons why that may have happened. So before I start, on your table, now some tables have got these images in colour and some have got them in black and white, but they're the same images. If you want to have a rummage through, are there any of those artworks illustrated there that you recognise? I think I know one that you definitely will recognise. Can you hold up the one or ones that you most recognise, that are most familiar to you? I can see some angels. I can see some other things. I can see some angels. I can see some horses. I can see a squiggly red thing. And another squiggly red thing over there in black and white. Okay. That gives me a good idea of what you're aware of in terms of public art, which is great, and we'll come back to that later on in the session. So Newcastle Gateshead, as you're proving your knowledge of the angel has just proven, is often cited as the leading example of how public art can act as a catalyst for urban regeneration. Particularly big, emblematic works like the Angel of the North, rising as it does from a former mining site and forged from industrial materials, while also standing as a distinctive visual form. The angel embodies, or has come to embody, the Northeast's move from an industrial-based economy and one predicated more on culture and the service industries. And that's a fundamental shift that was characterised in many former industrial cities, and particularly in the north of Britain, during the late 1980s and 90s. There are several factors that give rise to the phenomena of urban cultural regeneration and its strong relationship with public art. Perhaps the most important factor is the succession of government initiatives that have tried to make those deindustrialised areas, particularly ones that were deemed economically or socially problematic, into newly attractive places in which to live, work and invest. Although completely unsupported by robust evidence, a policy rhetoric has emerged that public art could support these regeneration ambitions by, amongst other things, reducing vandalism, engaging communities with a sense of place, enhancing private sector investment, and building social cohesion. Big ideas. And it was expected that part of this benefit would be achieved through the aesthetic appeal of the artworks being commissioned, and part through the processes by which these artworks would be delivered. So-called participative art activity was seen to attend to some of the soft impact factors that politicians wanted to see as an outcome of this regeneration and new investment. Things like overcoming community differences and particularly taking communities on a journey from old ways of thinking into a new place. Importantly, the 1990s was also a time when concepts of the creative city and the creative class took hold. Charles Landry, who founded the UK think tank Comedia, wrote of the creative city in a report produced in the wake of Glasgow's year as European City of Culture in 1990. And from there arose an argument that all aspects of a city, its politics, its design, its economics, should be approached creatively to enable distinctiveness and growth. The irony here being that the rhetoric of the creative city became so widespread that it generated instead a sense of sameness. Every city vaunted its creative credentials, and every city had its shiny new landmark building. At the same time, from the United States, Richard Florida influentially argued that diversity and creativity, and crucially the fostering of the creative class, were the basis for future urban growth. Both concepts, the creative city and the creative class, have now been quite heavily critiqued. But at the time, in the 1990s, they really took hold with developers and with politicians alike, and these people eagerly took up that headline idea and ran with it. A key manifestation for this enthusiasm in the creative city idea was the rise in starchitecture, flagship urban developments that in form and function signalled the turn to culture. In Glasgow, for example, the transformation of the riverside to include new buildings like the Scottish Exhibition and Conference Centre, which is shaped like the Sydney Opera House and designed by architects Foster and Partners, followed by Zaha Hadid's Riverside Museum in 2011, and the SSE Hydro, which is the largest music venue in the UK, in 2013, visually marked this new ambition. And if we think this through here to Newcastle Gateshead, we can map a similar transformation in our own riverside, both through landmark buildings like the Millennium Bridge, the Baltic, and the Sage Gateshead, of course, but also through a plethora of public artworks, many of which have spoken to Newcastle's Tyneside's industrial and maritime past, while signalling towards a new cultural future. So some of you might be familiar with some of these artworks down on our quayside, including Rolling Moon, which is on the Gateshead side in Gateshead Riverside Park, but visible from the Newcastle side of the city. A series of sculptures created for Newcastle Business Park back in the 1990s, and you can see those if you walk along the quayside towards Newburn. And a string of artworks installed as part of Terry Farrell's master plan for Newcastle's East Quayside. And there you might be familiar with Andre Wallace's twin figures, Siren and River God, near the Law Courts, Ray Fulcher's architectural swirl pavilion, and the collaborative sculpture, which is the towering Blacksmith's Needle, which is quite a landmark along the Newcastle quayside. Finally, and also important in this move to cultural regeneration, was the growth in national and international cultural accolades. Glasgow, being the first post-industrial city to reorientate its economy and identity through gaining European Capital of Culture status. Previously, places awarded this Capital of Culture were cities already recognised as cultural centres, such as Athens, Florence, and Paris, whereas Glasgow's reputation was more for gritty industry, poor health, and gang violence, quite a contrast. Glasgow subsequently became City of Architecture and Design in 1999 and has since played host to major exhibitions and events, including the Turner Prize and the Commonwealth Games. The success of Glasgow gave other cities the impetus to follow a similar path. So think Gateshead's Garden Festival of 1990 that happened just after I came to Newcastle, and then Newcastle Gateshead's own bid for Capital of Culture in 2008, which you might remember, and which actually we failed to achieve, and it went to Liverpool, which everybody in Newcastle, I was working at the Arts Council at the time, was a bit upset about. And of course, our recent hosting of events like the 2019 World Transplant Games, and along with festivals such as the Great Exhibition of the North, which was here in 2018. So through all this activity, public art became synonymous with urban regeneration. Interestingly, while Glasgow had some neighbourhood-based public art schemes, it doesn't have any landmark public artworks. In recent decades, it's really Gateshead that can lay claim to taking the lead in monumental scale, big public art. Indeed, Gateshead Council has the longest history of local authority-led public art commissioning in the UK. It set up its own Art in Public Places programme way back in 1986. And Gateshead might be known for the Angel of the North, but without a significant amount of activity, support and experience built beforehand, much of this through the work of the council's former public art curator, Anna Pepperell, who worked for the council from the early 1990s onwards, back actually in the 1980s onwards, up until the Angel and beyond. The Angel itself would never have come into being. In fact, it's important to recognise that the Angel of the North, while for many people being an artwork which is synonymous with the term public art, is actually something of a rarity. Most art realised in the context of urban regeneration is not what is termed monumental at all. Much is on a much smaller scale and more local scale. However, what I want to focus on in the rest of the talk is this particular strand of public art practice where monumentalism, scale and size really does seem to matter. Going back to the images on your tables, does anybody have an opinion or anybody know which the biggest artwork represented there is? Which is the biggest of those artworks?
Depends what you mean by big.
That's a good, exactly what do we mean by big? Massive, tall, long.
In how many dimensions?
Good question. We'll come back to this. We'll come back to these questions in the discussion. I might try and give you some answers, but we'll come back to it. You can tell me, I might tell you which one's the biggest, but you can tell me which one's the best in our discussion. So the Angel of the North, as some of you pointed out, possibly indicated, stands at 20 metres tall, and it has a wingspan of 54 metres. But its location on a high mound above the A1 enhances its sense of stature in the landscape. The Angel is undoubtedly emblematic and a lasting regional landmark, and it's often lauded as the most recognised sculpture in Britain, and sometimes the world. But in thinking about urban regeneration, what the arrival of the Angel seemed to spark back in 1998 when it was completed was a national thirst for bigger, but not necessarily better, public sculptures. One of the first projects that emerged from this new national demand was a proposal for the Ebbsfleet Landmark, a new public artwork to raise the profile of the Ebbsfleet development down in Kent and to mark the site of the new HS1 Eurostar rail station. The brief for the £2 million commission specifically called for a landmark sculpture that would be twice as high as the Angel of the North. And thus the project quickly gained the sort of nickname, the Angel of the South. Has anybody heard of that project, the Angel of the South? No. Yeah, no. Publicly announced in 2007 and due to be completed by 2010, the giant sculpture was intended to be visible from road, rail and air. As is often the case with flagship works of art, 5 big-name artists were shortlisted for the commission. Turner Prize winners Rachel White-Reed, Richard Deacon and Mark Wallinger, French artist Daniel Buron, and sculptor Christopher Lebrun. After public consultation, but ultimately chosen by a selection panel, Mark Wallinger's concept, which is entitled The White Horse of Ebbsfleet, was named the winning proposal. So I haven't got a picture. Imagine an open expanse of fields with an electricity pylon to the left and a huge white horse, 33 times life size, and therefore only slightly smaller than the pylon, standing on the right. That's the White Horse of Ebbsfleet. When the project was announced, it was claimed that half of the funding needed for the work had been secured, with the plan that the remainder would be raised from private donations. As the project progressed, the original costs are said to have escalated to around £15 million, and Wallinger's White Horse project subsequently stalled. Fast forward to today, to 2020, and this public artwork remains only as a design concept, with a strong sense that it now never will be realised. Similarly, in 2011, a design competition, The Great Unknown, was launched in Scotland by the Gretna Landmark Trust to get ideas for new landmark artwork that would celebrate the southern entrance to Scotland at Gretna, or Gretna Green. The expectation was that this new landmark would be an attractor for tourism and investment, As at Ebbsfleet, the artwork was to be at least twice the size of the Angel of the North. The winning design proposal, entitled the Star of Caledonia, is a collaboration between the late landscape architect Charles Jenks and the respected structural engineer Cecil Balmond. Consisting of two futuristic helix-like entwined arms illuminated by very bright lights, the Star of Caledonia is meant to symbolise Scottish innovation and to pay homage in particular to the 19th century physicist James Clerk Maxwell, who did pioneering work on electromagnetic theory. The scheme received planning permission in 2013, and the original completion date then slipped to 2015 to fit with the UNESCO International Year of Light. But that target was also missed. Projected to cost £4.8 million, Creative Scotland awarded the project £1 million from its capital funds. But this was later withdrawn when the project failed to secure further public money. In May 2019, however, planning permission was extended for a further 3 years to enable the project team to seek additional funding. So Jenks and Balmond's Star of Caledonia might still get a chance to shine. We'll see. More locally, in Middlesbrough, the giant sculpture Temenos. That's only one, it's currently one of 5 proposed Tees Valley giants to have been completed. Temenos is 110 metres long and just under 50 metres high. So already that's higher than the Angel of the North. It weighs 66 tonnes and uses over 8,000 metres of steel cable. The £2.7 million sculpture was funded by One North East, the regional development agency, while Tees Valley Regeneration came up with the original idea, and both organisations have since been disbanded. In 2012, the BBC reported that the other Tees Valley giants, which were designed to have one in each of the main towns of the Tees Valley, Stockton, Hartlepool, etc., were unlikely to materialise. Although reportedly, as is today, several of the Tees Valley local authorities are supportive of the scheme if external funding can be sought. So we may see some more giants down in Teesside. Like the White Horse of Ebbsfleet and the Star of Caledonia, and indeed the Angel of the North, Temenos is not only big in scale and big in cost, but also by an equally big name artist. In this case, Anish Kapoor is a British sculptor. So this now leads on to our main question: is bigger always better in public art terms? There does seem to be a common formula assumed in the projects I've been discussing, that scale, as in usually in tall, big, and culture, and big name artist, leads to regeneration of place and an expected economic boom. These are the expectations and the way these projects are sold and framed. Certainly, in examples of big public art projects that have been realised, like the Angel of the North, these artworks can have identifiable impact. For example, several of the public sculptures that Anish Kapoor has produced around the world have since become emblematic of their respected cities. His 2006 artwork for Boston, which is called Cloudgate, which is a big, shiny, stainless steel reflective sculpture, has since become more widely known as the Boston Bean, so it's very identified with the place that it is. Here in the UK, the Kelpies by Andy Scott near Falkirk in Scotland, and that's the 2 horses in those images there, are billed as the world's largest equine sculptures. Along with the nearby Falkirk Wheel, they're listed as one of the top 10 visitor attractions in Scotland. The Kelpies are visible from the nearby motorway, but also, interestingly, have their own visitor centre. In 2019, it was reported that over 3 million people had actively visited the Kelpies, and that it's claimed they had brought an estimated £1.5 million per year to the economy since they were installed. Likewise, research by a consulting firm into the expected impact of the Star of Caledonia project on the English-Scottish border at Gretna predicted it could be worth £16 million to the local economy in its first year alone through construction jobs, tourism, and national and international publicity. In all this, there is, however, very little discussion over whether these large-scale artworks are good art, or whatever good might mean in this context. The focus is instead very much on the perceived instrumental impacts and values of these projects, their social and economic impact. And what's of prime importance when these public art projects are put out for competition or publicly announced in the media is always scale. And the Angel of the North, as we've seen, is often an explicit measure to be beaten. It'd be interesting to see whether how far that goes on into the future, whether the Angel will always be that measure. After scale, it seems that the next most significant factor is always the artist and their national or international reputation. And both of these, the artwork and the artist, need to be big. Very few reports discuss the specific content or the concept of the artwork in any depth or in any critical manner. If anything, most only provide a sort of shorthand explanation for the meanings of these works. For example, that Mark Wallinger's white horse proposal for Ebbsfleet references the horse as an ancient symbol of Kent, and that you'll see that sort of message quite often, and it doesn't really go into much more depth than that. It seems there's a presumption that if the artist is recognised by the art establishment as being at a certain level of quality, for example, as a Turner Prize winner, as Mark Wallinger is, for example, then that is enough to justify the excellence and success of the resulting artworks. What critical discussion there is tends to be over whether public art is in and of itself a worthwhile investment. Hence the usual recourse to instrumental arguments about economic benefit and tourism, and sometimes jobs. There's very little discussion of whether this is actually interesting art, or whether its concept, the artwork's concept, is fitting for its location, the purpose, and the contemporary context, or whether the proposed form the artwork takes has artistic merit. All these things are subjective, but the main point is no one is out fighting for these monumental statements as artworks in their own right. Rather, they're seen for what they can do as place markers, as cultural signifiers, and tools for economic regeneration. In an article strongly condemning the rhetoric of scale in public art practice, Jonathan Jones, who's an art critic writing in The Guardian back in 2008, states that projects of this type, quote, typify the bizarre mixture of hubris and bureaucratic machismo that is currently saddling Britain with a marvellous legacy of scrap metal. He goes on to critique the fashion for such large-scale proposals as an absurd cultural tic, an inane fashion that wants regenerative, massive, epic works of art now, immediately. The reality is, however, that very little of this type of art is being realised now, and we have to ask ourselves why, and we think there are a number of reasons. The first of these, of course, is money. The prime reason for the failure of public artworks to be realised is the difficulty in securing funding. During the 1990s especially, the fashion for the cultural and creative city drove investment. That was clear, and that's what led to the Angel. The success of Glasgow and areas like Newcastle Gateshead, with its Angel and transformed Riverside, seemed to give confidence to a certain formula by which meaningful regeneration could be achieved through a turn to culture. Over recent decades, serious critiques of the creative city narrative have begun to emerge. These argue that cataclysmic step-change style investment in big cultural statements, buildings and public artworks has limited social benefit, and that sustained investment in smaller, rooted enterprises can yield longer-term economic gain. This turn away from this creative city idea happened just as the austerity agenda was also kicking in. And the consequence is that today, the public appetite and the political appetite for such grandstanding cultural statements as these big public artworks has now waned considerably, with the potential criticism for proposing such a project is significant. The second reason for failure, perhaps, is the critique of art washing, an artist-led and activist movement that has emerged that calls out artists who are seen as being complicit in the process of regeneration, especially where their involvement might be construed as being complicit in the gentrification of an area. Art washing has also been used as a critique of corporate investment in contemporary art production as a form of PR. Although this is a relatively recent movement, and therefore probably not a primary reason why the specific artworks I've been discussing so far have failed, it's perhaps a key factor that will come into play in the fortunes of future public art projects, as will potentially environmental agendas. Thirdly, we might look to shifting practices within public art itself. As public art was gaining traction within the context of urban regeneration, so were moves to more strongly participative art practices, practices that are either wholly about social involvement and which might not have a physical outcome in terms of an artwork or a sculpture, or processes underpinning the creation of a physical artwork which in various ways engaged local communities. Increasingly, in terms of placemaking, participation was seen as an essential and fundamental aspect of public art's claim to impact positively on well-being and social inclusion. Temporary and relatively low cost, with few on-costs, this growing trend towards socially engaged practice is, however, a very different creature to the grandstanding artworks that we're looking at tonight. Thinking about participation and public art's intended audiences and beneficiaries raises a number of questions. Are these landmark public artworks about benefit to people within an existing community, or about attracting new people to a place? In this kind of practice, do scale and stature of the artist matter, but community, artwork content, and quality less so? Are the resulting artworks inflated in both physical scale and by PR bluster, beyond their artistic content? Or perhaps they are distorted by planning processes and regulations, as well as by the need for wide public approval? In 2023, Newcastle Quayside will see the arrival of a new giant, a multi-million-pound leisure complex which will include a huge Ferris wheel called the YI. Has anybody noticed this in the local media? Just as landmark stararchitecture was once the big thing any city must have, now, contemporary times, 2020, it seems you need to have a spectacular Ferris wheel. The YI will be 140 metres high. Importantly, it's 5 metres taller than the London Eye. That's what the media tell us, very important. But it'll also be accompanied by a 12-metre tall Geordie giant, which, as the developers put it, is intended to encapsulate the giant spirit of the people of Newcastle Gateshead. That's us. The project's scale, concept, form, and function are all designed to attract visitors and to drive commercial investment. Perhaps this new giant complex encapsulates one of the key problems that grandstanding, regeneration-focused public art. The supposed social and economic drivers outweigh the artwork's concept and quality. And you might question whether this new giant is an artwork anyway. As Jonathan Jones has suggested, there's a danger here that we have reduced aesthetic issues to machismo boasting over scale, and not having learnt lessons from the recent past, we homogenise our cities and towns with vacuous visual statements that say little about where we actually are, where or who we actually are. With this new Geordie giant on the horizon, it seems timely to remind ourselves that size is not necessarily everything.